All right, so welcome. We're just going to do a quick overview of how we organize our engineering work in Protect and how we order our priorities and how we work with the front end development team. Is that a fair summary of what you're looking for out of this?
Yeah, that's spot on.
So we actually do this a little bit different from all of the rest of GitLab, for better or for worse, but the process has actually worked really well for us. So we've stuck with it now for more than a year. Essentially, as a product manager, I'm in charge of priorities first and foremost. I mean, that's one of the most core responsibilities for my job. So to manage those, I've actually created a priorities board or a priorities issue that stays open. You can see this is created more than a year ago. We've left it open that entire time. And for my group in particular, we are a little bit unique in that we have some pretty specific guidance in how we should be allocating our time between our different categories. So we have a security orchestration category, container scanning category, container host security, and you can see here the target allocation and how many engineers we currently have working on each of these categories. So you can always come in here and see how that maps to each of these. In fact, we're down one engineer, we just hired another one, so we'll probably bump one of these up by one. Either container scanning will go from 1 to 2, or we'll allocate someone to container host security here in the near term. So these are kind of the core priorities. Not all of these epics require front-end work though. So at the bottom, we also have a front-end priorities table. And these are just repeats of the things that are in the other categories, but specific to things that require front-end work. So that way, the back-end team can come in and they can allocate their resources accordingly. They can start them on the top priority items and have them work down. And the same is true for the front-end team, where they have their priorities and they can pick things off the top and work their way down. So at a really high level, this priorities issue is where everything starts if it's related to new feature work. And I'll talk about like bugs and tech debt here in a minute, because those are handled a little bit differently. But if it's new feature work, it always starts from these priority issues, this priority issue. So for example, we've got this cluster image scanning item that's being worked on by the backend team. We have an engineering DRI for the backend for that. We have a rough ballpark estimate. This is always, of course, subject to change, but a rough estimate of when we think we can have that completed and released to customers. And we actually broke that one into 2 pieces. This one's a little bit unique, but for iteration purposes, we broke it into 2 pieces for the front end team, priorities 1A and 1B. And at the moment, we only have one front end engineer, so the DRI is the same for all of them. It makes it a little bit, makes it simple. But we just work our way down all of these. And so we do actually follow the workflow process of the rest of GitLab. So if I come into cluster image scanning, may not be the best one, but let me see if there's a good one for this. So let's see if this even has a design issue associated with it. This mostly is backend work. Yeah, that one's all backend work. Well, let's look at this cluster image scanning anyway, and we'll take a look at how we did this. So we actually create these high-level priority items as an epic, because that allows us to spread the work between front end and back end. It allows us to group everything together. We can keep our design issue in here as well. So this is where we differ from a lot of the rest of GitLab, where they typically have an issue to track the work. We found that just became overly hard to keep track of everything. So we put all the requirements up in the epic. You'll see the designs here. Once the design work is completed and finalized, we actually close out our design issue, and then we copy the designs up to the description of the parent epic. So that way we always have one place to go for product management requirements, as well as UX designs. And then for iteration purposes, we can break this down as much as we want into sub-epics or individual implementation issues that can be assigned out to the front end and back end. So as we move this through the workflow process, it actually starts out workflow, depending on the problem, it can start out workflow problem validation. It then moves into ready for design, at which point we create a design issue, and you can see the design issues here. They're easily noticeable because they've got that little icon and prefixed with the design label. And if we come into any of these, you can see we've designed out, for example, some of the policy error states. This is going to be assigned out to the UX designer. They're going to iterate on the mocks in here, and then only once the mocks are finalized and they've decided that this is what we're going with, then they'll close out this issue. They'll copy these designs and they'll put them up on the parent epic. And then once all of that design work is complete, so typically like a new epic for this won't have all of these sub issues in it, because that's just really overwhelming and we're not even ready to work on it. So normally this actually will be really blank. We'll just have the parent epic and then we'll just create the design issue. In fact, I can show you an example of another one that's kind of in that state right now, where here we're looking out at the option of giving the ability to approve merge request approval rules individually. So right now there's an approve button that just approves everything that you're eligible to approve. We're talking about potentially breaking this out so you can approve these things separately one by one. So we've got our parent epic here. We've linked some of the user research that led to this. We have a design issue that's created specific to work out the designs, but you'll notice there's actually no front end issues or back end issues in here. We're not trying to work out the implementation details yet because we're not ready for it. So there just isn't work. We don't get those. Those don't show up on the boards, planning boards for the front end team, because we're not ready for them to do that work yet. So those don't even exist at all. All the product requirements and discussion is happening at the epic level. And then again, once this finishes out, once we finish the design, we'll move this from, this actually should be workflow ready for design, because I think we've had enough validation at this point. And once that goes through design, then we'll move it into workflow planning breakdown. When we do that, we'll discuss in our weekly team meeting and have all of the engineers review it just to make sure that they don't have any questions or concerns or things that need to be clarified that we didn't think about when we did the designs or the requirements. Assuming that it's all clear and they understand what needs to be done and why, then we move it into workflow refinement. And when it goes into workflow refinement, then it gets assigned out to an individual front end and an individual back end engineer to do that refinement. We actually can't assign out epics right now, which is unfortunate. So right now we just handle that by putting a message, just adding a comment saying this is ready for refinement, and we tag the appropriate, I'll tag the EM and the EM will assign that out by tagging one of their individual engineers to do that refinement. As part of that refinement, the engineer is responsible for fleshing out all of the implementation steps. So that's really the point where they start to create all of those other issues that are nested inside of this epic. And usually at that point, it's getting pretty close to being ready for development. So just by following that workflow, we actually end up with not too many front-end issues that are not ready for development.
No, thanks for the overview. I think so. A follow-up question for you, if you are kind of finished going through the process. This is very insightful. I think so how do you guys even have a backlog? Because I mean, I think the problem is that we start a lot of the times with an issue, and then if the issue is large enough, we promote to an epic, because sometimes we're getting issues created by, we have legacy issues either created by engineers or product managers of like, hey, these are ideas we want to explore, and an issue gets created, it's not really flushed out, but they want to track that. Like maybe we got feedback from, customer support, that this is a feature that a customer is asking for, and they just create an issue to kind of track it, and it just gets dumped in the backlog. If you don't mind, if I can share my screen, yeah, like the view that we're looking at that was kind of concerning was, so we have this, let me see. I have to add milestone. Backlog. It might take a second to load here. So a lot of these issues aren't implementation issues. Like, for example, like this one, right? This is 3 years ago. Dependency scanning for Rust, right? There's a little bit of discussion. It was just kind of something that was like, you know, along Felipe is a security engineer. He moved teams, but he was originally an engineer on this team. And, you know, and I think like a lot of features that were like ideas get created as an issue and then nothing happens with them. So like stuff like this might be one that we might close out, right? But then if it's something that, you know, we still want to do, then the person can reopen it or just leave it closed. So I guess that's where things were a little bit ambiguous. Like what we were going to do as a team process, which is, you know, we have right now, I guess there's not a count up here for the number of open issues, but there are pages and pages and pages of things that are over 3 years old. So what we had was an automation script that one of the engineers in our team created to like bulk close anything older than 3 years. The idea would be if anyone disagreed with closing that issue, that they could reopen it if they still think it's still valid, or hey, we definitely need to do this. But then at the same time, if it was a high priority, would have already been looked at and not 3 years stale. So my concern was that, okay, if we bulk close these, they were still, how do we ever get back to it if it's something that's interesting? You know, something we eventually want to do, right? But, you know, it's still recorded in the history because it's still an issue, but it's closed now. So do we close them, but then apply a label of like vintage or like still desirable, but not, you know, high priority, you know, some label to convey that meaning. So in that process, I kind of ran into what is it? This milestone, awaiting further demand, which has a bunch of issues in it. I just don't understand the workflow for this. Are these issues that are currently open, don't belong in the backlog, but we can, you know, still need more demand? So to me, it seems this is like like a deep backlog, if you want to say that, because here the definition, the description is indicates that an issue has been triaged, but not yet on the backlog. So that's why I was saying, like, if we have a bunch of stuff in the backlog that may be desirable, but it's not a high priority, we can push it back into waiting for the demand to clear up that backlog. But, you know, and then the other thing is, if we were going to try to, we're trying to clean it up. So like even if we adopt the process that Protect has going forward, what do we do with all the other ones that are legacy? And that's the kind of part that's a bit ambiguous for us. So we've experimented with the idea of auto closing ones that are older than a year or two, and then applying like an auto close label, and then the archive, I think archive label to indicate that they were archived. And then the idea being that if you wanted to search for issues that were probably still desirable, but nowhere near in the radar because they're very old, you could search closed issues by archive, you know. But then, you know, these are like process things that are not standard at GitLab right now. So then, you know, my concern is closing them out and then not having everyone on board on a standard approach to do that. So the real question comes down to this is, what do we do with issues that are very, very stale? Do we close them? Do we leave them open and apply certain labels? Do we leave them open and move them to a different milestone? Do we close them and move them to a different milestone? And that's what I've been trying to kind of reach out and get a feel for from different product managers, because I feel like things like that are in the backlog, you know, are accessed by developers, engineer managers, and product management. So I didn't know an ideal approach, and especially since that backlog that I was showing you before is for the all secure, and this is the issue, right? So we have over 300 open issues that have these tags, and the goal is to kind of, you know, so these, yeah, and these are the parameters that we were looking at, right? Is it still relevant? Yeah.
If this, you know, like that issue that you showed, add support for Rust, for example. If that was a thing on the protect side, I can tell you what we would do with those type of issues.
Sure.
Obviously you're gonna have to figure out what works best for you and for your group and for your stage. But for us, the approach that we would take is, first of all, that would be promoted to an epic because that's a new feature request. It's actually a rather large one, adding support for a whole new language. And probably we're going to need to break that down into several smaller implementation steps when we actually get to that point. So that definitely would get promoted to an epic right away. The other thing that we would do is the product manager, myself, would take a look at that and decide, does this fit into our long-term direction, strategy, vision, or does it not? And if it does, then we actually end up adding it in. And I think the secure stage uses this as well, just perhaps not in the same way, but let me share my screen again here for a second. So what ends up happening is let me pull up one of these, like more granular vulnerability checks. So this ends up getting nested in an epic, a structure of epics, where at the high level, we have our vision for all of container security, for the entire container security group. And then you can see a different epic in here for each of the categories that we own. And then each of these get broken down. Here's what we needed to do to take security orchestration from plan to minimal. Here's what we need to do to go from minimal to viable, viable to complete, complete to lovable. And so that epic, assuming it is part of our long-term vision and strategy, it would get nested within one of these. And that alone, just by nesting that automatically gives some semblance of priority, because if we're at minimal today and it's in the complete to lovable category, then we're not getting to that for a really long time. And you can immediately tell that just by looking at where it falls in the epic structure. If it's not in line with our direction and strategy, and it's just flat out not something that we want to do, or even a merge request that we would accept into the product, then it just gets closed out. So that way, these things get promoted to epics. That way they don't show up on the issue boards, so they don't muddy the waters for like milestone planning for development. They also would get bucketed correctly up here, like complete to lovable. Epics actually don't have milestones, so we don't even have the problem of putting it in a backlog versus not. It's just kind of self-apparent by where it falls here. And then just by default, everything is kind of on the back, really long back burner unless it's on this priorities issue. So this priorities issue is our near-term backlog, and as these things come through, so I'm going to evaluate that item, adding support for Rust, for example. I'm going to ask myself, does that fall, which bucket does that fall in? First of all, is that in my vision? And then which bucket do I want to put it in? Is that something that's needed to get to lovable or complete or viable? If it's needed to get to viable, then I would say, okay, we're working on that right now. How does that compare in priority to the other things I already have on this list? And maybe that comes up here and it becomes priority number 2. Maybe that comes down here and it's priority 13. But this list really is just representative of more the next 12 months, we'll say, of what we've got in vision, and everything else would just sit there as an epic. But there would not actually be an issue associated with that until it got to the refinement phase, which, out of all of these, the only ones that have gone through refinement are really items 1 and 2, for example. So it's not like we have all of these refined. So the actual number of issues that exist for our stage is kept relatively small.
Yeah, no, I think, thanks for sharing that. I think that workflow solves a lot of the problems that we actually have. Now, I guess the tricky thing is, I guess what I can do is share this recording, and basically if we were going to adopt that approach, I mean, we need buy-in from a lot of different people that we work with in our group, but if they did, theoretically, then we would have to basically go through all those issues in that backlog make sure that we have like the breakdown of the epics and sub epics, see if they fit in any of those buckets. And for the ones that don't and aren't aligned with priorities, to just close them out. If we were adopting that approach, I'll take the info that you've given. This is very enlightening. So I'll share it if you're okay with that. I'll stop the recording now. If there was
there's a little bit more worth noting in here, just real quick. So I just want to call out that it seems overwhelming, like, oh, now we have to go through 300 issues and either promote them to an epic or get rid of them. You can actually do that in an iterative fashion, which is what we've done. Because we switched over to this about a year ago. We still have issues, plus, container scanning moved from secure over to protect, and all of those issues came over with it. So we actually have a lot of issues that are still out there in the backlog, including one I think that you found. And I'm like, oh, that should actually be promoted to an epic, right? So we still have cleanup work to do on our side as well, but it's possible to do that in an iterative fashion. It's not like you have to go through all 300 to switch over to this process. You can do that slowly over time, as long as the things that are on your near-term backlog, you've got to convert those right away, because that's what's impacting your near-term work. But everything else you can just gradually address as you have time.
That makes sense. So, okay. I'll take all this feedback and just, I'll try to share it with, I guess, Neil, who's, I guess, the engineering manager on our team, and reach out to the other product managers on our team to kind of see a feel for it. I think in the near future, though, because we're trying to just prune that backlog right now, we'll probably have to come up with some other alternative intermediary process, because it's probably going to take time. Do you mind me asking, how long did it take you guys to transition over to this?
So like I said, it didn't take long. It took, I don't know, 2 weeks to a month to transition. It wasn't a heavy transition, because basically what we did was we just took the near-term work and we started making those epics. So it's not like we tried to solve for the entire backlog right away. We just solved the immediate, like, next step work items and moved those to epics and put those in the right buckets. And we just started with that. And then we've been gradually cleaning up the backlog over time, but it's not all done. There's still issues that should be closed or should be promoted to epics out there. It's also worth noting too, separate from that, that we do leave bugs and tech debt items as issues. And that's because they're not like strategic items. They don't fall into that long-term vision. And they also typically don't need to be broken down into smaller things. So keeping it just as one single issue usually works really well for us.
Okay, awesome. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to kind of reach out and cover it. Yeah, appreciate all the effort you put into it too. So I'll share the video, and hopefully we'll be able to adapt some of that processes. From based on what I've seen, it seems very practical and efficient. So
yeah, absolutely happy to share more if needed.
Thanks.